Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Re-Federalist Report. This is Warhamster Brady, and joining me today, as quite often he does, Mr. Constitution, my constitutional mentor and good friend, Douglas V. Gibbs. Welcome, sir.
Hello there.
Doug just informed me that the sun is just coming up on the West Coast. I've spent the better part of an hour shoveling snow this morning. It's the softest snow you've ever seen. It was pure powder. I wish I had some skis, but no such luck. Instead, I had a shovel today. We got a good blanket of snow last night here in New Hampshire. Today's topic, we are going to do the third part of the series. We've been looking at Donald Trump's executive orders, and there's all things about this show. We're going to look at these things not necessarily from a legal standpoint, but from a constitutional standpoint. The question we're going to ask is this executive order within the parameters of executive authority? So far, in the first two episodes, most of them have been. In fact, a vast majority have been constitutional. Would you not agree?
Yeah.
Which is, of course, the opposite of what the media would have you believe, that he's being a dictator and usurping all his power. But we're trying to do this objectively, and I guess so far so good. All right, before we get on to new executive orders, we've got to touch on one that's very controversial. Trump had issued a moratorium on federal spending. We knew that was going to be fought. And, of course, a judge has now already put out a moratorium on that. And here's the headline: Federal judge temporarily blocks Trump administration freeze on federal grants and loans. Just read a couple paragraphs of it. A federal judge on Tuesday temporarily blocked a push from President Trump to pause federal funding while his administration conducts an across-the-board ideological review to uproot progressive initiatives. A lot of it's DEI type stuff. What's really at issue here is the reason where the outcry is coming from is it turns out there's an awful lot of people that rely on the federal government sending money to different organizations for their paycheck. That most certainly does need to be reviewed. The question is, and I think it's a fair question to ask, is just totally putting a halt on this the best way of doing it, rolling it out, or should it have been perhaps a little bit more of a due process so people were not totally caught by surprise? As of right now, go ahead.
Yeah, and whether or not he can, or whether or not he should, and whether or not how, is all the questions that we'll have here.
Yeah, so this judge in Washington State is Lauren Alicon. She blocked the funding freeze only minutes before we're scheduled to start. Now, it's only this freeze is only till Monday afternoon. The court's supposed to have a hearing to consider the issue. Another court's having a hearing on it. The White House hasn't commented, but it brings up a really interesting question, and that's of the concept of impoundment. Doug, you want to explain what impoundment is? And we'll talk about whether it is legal and how, what are the actual parameters of it.
Well, it comes down to whether or not the president has to spend the money exactly as appropriated by Congress. It's interesting because the power of impoundment goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. Presidents Roosevelt, Johnson, all used it. In fact, Trump used it. He didn't allocate all of the COVID funds. Power of impoundment, for those of you who are going, okay, Doug, yeah, but what is it? Basically, it is the president determining, if the funds are not appropriate, or the amount of funds exceeds what is necessary, then the president would have the authority to spend or not spend as he believes is necessary, as long as those expenditures don't exceed the maximum amount of money appropriated. So if the president of the United States believes the amount needs to be spent is less than what was appropriated, then he has every authority to spend the amount he needs to spend based on his discretion. If the amount of money that needs to be spent is greater than what was appropriated, then once the maximum amount appropriated is reached, then in order for more funds to be spent, Congress would have to, by law, appropriate more money toward the item in question. So it comes down to the president's whether or not the president has to spend an amount of money. And I mean, I can go deeper right now, or if you want, we'll talk about this a little bit more and I can get deeper into it.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a good description right there. here's where it comes into question: is in 1974, when Nixon was the
Mhm.
president, Congress passes the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974,
Right.
and basically they were saying they're trying to take their power back from the executive branch.
Yeah, because suddenly there's a president they don't like. They had no problem with it while Johnson was doing it. I mean, and understand, the presidential power of impoundment prior to 1974 was recognized as a legitimate constitutional power of the president of the United States by both sides, and so that's first thing. So if something is a constitutional power, it's recognized as a constitutional power. Can Congress use legislation to strip a president of a constitutional power previously viewed as constitutional?
No, that should require an amendment, shouldn't it?
Right.
It really should have when you read this thing. But what this act basically did is it created two types of impoundment. You had rescission. That's if the president wants to, if he wants to permanently cancel appropriated funds, he's got to propose a rescission to Congress. He needs permission, and then Congress has 45 days to approve.
Mm-hmm.
The other power is deferral, where he can delay spending on certain funds, but this deferral can't go past the end of the fiscal year. And Congress can also disapprove. So it really it restricted the power of impoundment since 1974.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this has been challenged in court. I mean, it happened very quickly with something called Train versus City of New York in 1975.
Mm-hmm.
Supreme Court rules against Nixon's decision to withhold funds for water pollution control, affirming that the president, here's a quote, does not have the inherent power to impound funds without congressional authority. Now, where it gets interesting, and there's been a couple others. There was Clinton versus City of New York. There's a couple other legal challenges. The biggest one, of course, was the Government Accountability Office found that the Trump administration had violated the Impoundment Control Act by withholding military aid to Ukraine, which, yeah.
And see, think about this now. Think about what's being said here. Congress is basically saying that you will spend every penny appropriated by Congress for whatever the item is provided by law. You have to spend every penny as demanded. And then, so now you have to ask, well, can Congress in the real world situation know exactly how much something is going to cost, or any changing situations along the way? I mean, the president, recognizes in the real world situation sometimes that the expenditure may have been too much, or the amount of money needs to be spent is greater, and that's that's because the president's the one that executes the laws. I mean, could you imagine? Give me an example. Let's say you're a little kid. Mom gives you some money and says, because you're like, Mom, I want some candy. Blah, blah, blah. So, fine, here's $10 for candy. And then you're ready to go spend your $10 of candy, and then you see this video or the show on TV about how bad candy is for your teeth, and you decide, you know what, I'm not going to spend the $10 on candy. Is mom then going to say, no, it has to be candy, you have to spend all of it? It's of course that's unreasonable. Or imagine mom gave the child $10 to pick up a dozen eggs. Nowadays, that's not highly, but anyway, and the store's selling them for $5.99. So he buys the eggs, returns home with $4.01 change, because the entire $10 was not necessary for the eggs. The goal of purchasing a dozen eggs was accomplished, so the change was returned to the mother. She's not going to be like, no, I gave you $10 for eggs. Return those eggs. Go find someone who will sell you eggs for $10. You have to spend all the money, of course. Or perhaps he finds out before he departs that dad picked up eggs on the way, so the expenditure is no longer necessary. Or perhaps the situation, the store is closed, or the store is going to have a sale later, and so let's hold the money until, so in the real application, the decision on how to spend the money and how much money to spend has to be within the president. The presidential power of impoundment is necessary because it's up to the president, who's tasked with executing the law, and when he takes the money and plans for its expenditure, and once he attempts to apply it to real world situation, maybe the expenditure is damaging. Maybe it's problematic. Maybe it doesn't need to be spent after all. Maybe, it needed to be appropriated for an original item, but there's another item that takes care of the same thing. Or in the case of Thomas Jefferson, the money was appropriated for to increase the naval power along the Mississippi River. But then after the Louisiana Purchase, that was no longer necessary because we now owned both sides of the river. So the money wasn't spent. Power of impoundment.
So what you're arguing for is some discretion in the execution of duly elected laws. But you brought up another interesting point. Sometimes situations change.
Right.
In this particular case, there's a gigantic change. We have a new president that the American people elected based on his agenda and certain things. And Congress had passed some spending before that. And it gets dangerous here because we've seen this. Best example is the midnight judges. An outgoing, registration or faction, they can handcuff the incoming administration to an amazing degree. What would stop a Democratic Congress from completely, at the last minute, passing all kinds of spending bills and handcuffing an incoming Republican presidency, or vice versa? It's an important topic, and it's dangerous.
A bill that he would not have signed. They would not have been able, with the congressional ability to, with a congressional vote, able to reverse that veto and put in a law in anyway. So why would he have to spend money? He wouldn't have. He wouldn't have signed. Couldn't care to spend.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope going both directions. There are arguments we made both directions. It's going to be very interesting to see how this is argued next week and to see what happens. I think a compromise solution may come up where he gets most of what he wants, but they have to show a little bit more discretion. And there are some people that don't deserve to be hurt, that are dependent. The best example is Meals on Wheels. This is for senior citizens, and if that's not funded, these people aren't going to get their meals. Now that has a direct real world impact, and something that we ought to, hopefully there's some compassion and that gets weeded out or sorted out very quickly. But from a constitutional standpoint, this is a big deal. It needs to be, it's going to have to get adjudicated. And I think this does fast track to Supreme Court.
Well, and many presidents, especially in the 20th century, has used the power of impoundment. Yeah. It was recognized as a power. So once again, I want us to look back at history, because here's the thing about this particular Supreme Court. Historical application now is a big deal to the court. So we see that it is, once again, and I'm kind of repeating myself, but I want to make sure you understand this. Ulysses S. Grant used the power. Roosevelt used the power. Johnson used the power. For example, there's many more. I'm just using those off the top of my head. Eisenhower used the power. The power was recognized as being legitimate. While there were minor challenges along the way, the power largely was uninfluenced and unquestioned. Suddenly, everybody hates Nixon. The Democrats hate Nixon. Suddenly, they take it because of that hated guy, and that suddenly allows Congress to change something that's recognized as constitutional with a piece of legislation. I believe that the Supreme Court will find in favor of Trump on this one. The power of impoundment, the court cases and that law were unconstitutional. And now we get back to what I've said before in Garland versus United States, and the judicial opinion by Clarence Thomas in that 2019 case, that if the Constitution is egregiously violated, we must reverse it. Clarence Thomas recognizes that. Now, that's what Dobbs v. Jackson was. Exactly that. So, we can't say, yeah, but court precedent, rulings say, they're going to look back further. They're going to see that it was a recognized constitutional authority. I really do think that this court will find in favor of presidential power of impoundment.
We're going to go a little bit deeper in this when we start going into these executive orders. So that's a good place to start there. What I think will happen is all the lower courts are going to maintain that freeze or the pause on Trump's order until it does get to the Supreme Court, and it should move pretty quickly, because it needs to. All right, so going through the whitehouse.gov list, we're going to jump back in. Now, once again, as an explanation, the way the White House has been listing these, it's new executive orders to the oldest. And we're going through the exact opposite order we should have. We started with the newest instead of starting with the oldest. So we're going to finish up the old ones, and then we're going to have to bounce all the way back to the top of the list and do some new ones that have come out in the last few days since we started this series. And we should be able to get through all of them today unless Trump has dumps a whole bunch more on us, which, of course, is entirely possible because this guy does not sleep.
And we may have to have another episode because suddenly a whole bunch of them pop up.
Wouldn't that be a shame? All right, the last one we did the other day was putting America first in international environmental agreements. We finished with that last episode. The one we're starting right here with delivering emergency price relief for American families in defeating the cost of living crisis. Over the past 4 years, Biden's destructive policies have caused inflation, et cetera, et cetera. In particular, the assault on plentiful and reliable American energy through unnecessary and illegal regulatory demands has driven up the cost of transportation manufacturing. True. It says more Americans are unable to purchase homes due to historically high prices. It's partially true. And some unprecedented regulatory oppression from the Biden administration is estimated to have imposed almost $50,000 in costs on the average American household, whereas my first-term agenda reduced regulatory costs by almost $11,000. So he's talking about, so here's the order. I hereby order the heads of all executive departments and agencies to deliver emergency price relief consistent with applicable law to the American people and increase the prosperity of the American worker. A little short on detail so far. Continuing, this shall include pursuing appropriate actions to lower the cost of housing and expand housing supply, eliminate unnecessary and administrative expenses and rent-seeking practices that increase healthcare costs. That's a good one. Eliminate counterproductive requirements that raise the cost of home appliances, create employment opportunities for American workers, including drawing discouraged workers into the labor force, and eliminate harmful, coercive, in air quotes, climate policies that increase the cost of food and fuel. Within 30 days of the date of this memorandum, the Assistant to the President for Economic Policy shall report to me and every 30 days thereafter on the status of the implementation of this moratorium. So it's very broad and sweeping. And
it's basically, we're drawing back regulations and we're unleashing the free market. That's basically what it says.
Yeah. It's very broad. It is short on details. Basically, it's a marching orders for the head of every one of his departments to start getting rid of, what he considers excessive regulation. Sounds like a great idea to me. Regarding inflation, Friedman said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena. That's mostly true. I mean, there are ways of reducing cost. If the cost of energy goes down, if that the cost of producing most goods and services goes down. At the same time, the monetary policy, the money supply, is the number one driver of inflation. They've put an awful lot of money into circulation over the last 5 years. That money has not left the system. The inflation genie is going to be very hard to put back in its bottle.
And what he's talking about is fiat money, which is basically money that has no value behind it. So then the way to do it, to reduce inflation, is if you can't reduce the money supply, then you got to increase the value in the system. And when you begin manufacturing domestically, when you begin creating goods and unleashing the free market, and then as a result, consumerism rises, not because you threw a bunch of money in their pockets, but because there's more product out there to purchase. Then as that value in the system goes up, that forces inflation numbers down.
And just to get a visual of what that looks like, this is the M2 money supply, one of the broader measures. And you can see up until 2020, there's about $14 trillion of money in supply. Mm-hmm. It shoots up during COVID, continues to shoot up during the Biden years. And right now the money supply is sitting there at about 50% higher than it was just 5 years ago. That money's got to go someplace. Mm-hmm. And it does drive up costs. When you have too much money chasing up the same amount of goods, the price goes up. So the way, it's really hard to contract the money supply. So what you have to do is increase productivity and grow your way out of it. And that's the whole idea.
And manufacturing, that's domestic manufacturing. And so that's where these tariffs are important, because it's going to encourage the larger companies to create domestic means of manufacturing the goods. But also, you want innovation, you want new products. And this is where you unleash the free market also for innovation. And this is where the AI thing was important, because it's the next big boom. It's going to create a lot of innovation. And we want that to be on the American side.
Yeah, there will be, well, we're not going to do a full economic episode, but I will say that there's going to be a big tug of war between strengthening the dollar and weakening it. I think the trend will be a weaker dollar over the next couple of years. And that's very beneficial to our exporters. It makes imports more expensive, but it makes exports a lot better. Unfortunately, the rest of the world will try to weaken their own currency at the same time. So expect a lot of currency fluctuation going forward. All right, next executive order. Oh, is that executive order constitutional, Doug?
Absolutely.
Okay, I would concur.
I mean, because remember, executive orders, for those of you who've not watched the other episodes, so you don't remember, purpose of executive orders are proclamations or instructions to the executive branch on how to execute the laws of the United States. This is simply an instruction to his branch saying, hey, this is how we're going to do it.
Yeah,
not making law, not changing law.
No, it's more like changing policy. Some regulations are codified into law, though, so there will be some fights on some of them, especially the environmental regulations. Expect Trump's lawyers to have a very busy 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next one we have is the hiring freeze. Short and to the point. By my authority, blah, 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 I hereby order a freeze on the hiring of federal civilian employees to be applied throughout the executive branch. As part of this freeze, no federal civilian position that is vacant at noon on January 20th may be filled, and no new position may be created except as otherwise provided for in this memorandum or other applicable law. They're trying to reduce the size of the federal government by attrition. Mm-hmm. Which is a great way to do it. You know, some people are going to be quitting. Some people already have. Some people are going to be fired. And if you cease the hiring, all of a sudden you end up with a much smaller federal workforce. And this is a good thing. There are 2.87 million people that work for the federal government. There is another 10 million that work for contractors for the federal government. That is the biggest corporation in the history of the world. That's a bit of a problem. And Trump is addressing that.
And once again, the president, those who are employed by the executive branch, either directly or indirectly, contractors being indirectly, they operate and they are hired. They work at his pleasure. They are a part of the executive branch at his pleasure. He's the boss at the top. This is, to not allow him to do this would be like telling an owner of a company that he can't fire certain employees, or he can't put a hiring freeze. He cannot put certain people in certain positions. You know, he's the chief executive of the executive branch. It's his call.
He goes on to say within 90 days of the memorandum, the director of the OMB, Office of Management and Budget, and like I said in the first episode, OMB is all over these executive orders. They're going to have a huge role to play. Mm-hmm. And DOGE shall submit a plan to reduce the size of the federal government's workforce through efficiency improvements and attrition. Really important point here. Contracting outside the federal government to circumvent the intent of this memorandum is prohibited. You know, the federal government's freaking out over this, the bureaucratic state, because it's sort of like when we have a government shutdown, people are going to realize we don't need a bunch of this government. If everything, if we're basically, reducing the workforce by 50% and efficiency doesn't go down at all, it's going to send a pretty powerful message.
Right.
Constitutional
It's going to send an even more powerful message if government becomes more efficient, more gets done, and you got less people.
Yeah. And is this within his constitutional powers?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Very good. Okay, here's the regulatory freeze pending review. This is what we talked about with the impoundment. We've beat this one up pretty good already, but we'll just go over real quick. By the authority vested in me as president, I hereby order all executive departments to take the following steps. Do not propose or issue any rule or a manner, including by sending a rule to the Office of the Federal Register, until a department or agency appointed or designated by the president after noon on January 20, 2025 reviews and approves the rule. Immediately.
In other words, let the people in charge be in charge.
Yes. That's a very good way of putting it. Immediately withdraw any rules that have been sent to OFR but not been published so that they can be reviewed and approved. So that's the midnight judges. If anything that Biden regime tried to slip through the last minute, that's on freeze. And consistent with applicable law and subject to exceptions, consider postponing for 60 days from the date of this memorandum or any rules that have been issued for the purpose of reviewing any questions of law, blah, blah, blah. During the 60-day period where appropriate and consistent with applicable law, consider opening a comment period to allow interested parties to provide comments about the issues of fact, law, and policy. Anything more need to be gone over this one?
No. And he's basically saying that we're spending money we shouldn't be spending. And we want to take a look at it to make sure. He's not just saying, oh, well, we're just not going to spend it. And I'm freezing it for now. And we're going to look at it. We're going to determine whether or not it's good to be spending it. I don't understand how any court can say that's unconstitutional. Even if they're against the power of impoundment, he's not saying I'm not spending it. He's saying I'm not spending it at the moment until we take a look at it. I want things to be more efficient. And, it's funny because when he began talking about government efficiency, Department of Government efficiency, the first question on everybody's mind was, well, how can the Democrats argue against efficiency? They are.
Yeah, and this one's even more than just the one about spending. It's about making new rules. Mm-hmm. Knock it off with the regulations until we review them to see if they make sense. And right. I don't know who was it to say, what's the old theory? For every new rule you make, you got to get rid of 3.
Well, that was Reagan, and actually that's where that comes from. And when it comes to regulations, the problem with regulatory actions by the executive branch, and this is supposed to have been done away with the Chevron deference case, is they tend to interpret as they see fit. And remember, these are people now that this bureaucracy has essentially become institutionalized. They operate for the sake of the functioning of the government. Right and wrong and efficiency no longer matters.
Yeah, trust the experts is how it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And we know how well that worked out in COVID and other type things. Very much constitutional power.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, jumping back in. We have the return to in-person work. Now, I don't know if I told this anecdote last time, but not long ago, I had to go give some deposition at a federal in a federal office building to a U.S. attorney.
Mm-hmm.
No worries, I'm not in any trouble. As I go to this, nor will I be in this case. I'm the one who spotted the issue. I get to this federal building and get up after going through taking 10 minutes to get my laptop through screening. I'm walking through this 4th floor where it's nothing but row after row after row of blacked out rooms with not a single soul to be seen in the middle of a weekday workday until I get, all the way back, after passing 50 offices, I get back to the conference room where there's 3 people. It's an entire floor. It's just a complete ghost. And I mentioned this to the U.S. attorney, and he said something about work from home. But I was half tempted to go back this week and take a look at it to see if people have actually shown up after this executive order. This is a real simple one. Heads of all departments and agencies in the executive branch of government shall, as soon as practical, take all necessary steps to terminate remote work arrangements and require employees to work in person at their respective duty stations on a full-time basis, provided that the department and agency heads shall make exemptions they deem necessary. Pretty short and to the point, Doug.
Not only constitutional, I saw a video of a federal worker complaining about this. I think I want to say it was Instagram. I'm not positive. And they're basically crying because A, they're going to have to work harder, and B, because they have to go to work, it'll be harder for them to run their out of their garage hairstyling business.
Yeah, not only that, but some of these people have decided, I don't want to pay, real high rent in DC, and I can move to Iowa and, earn the same salary I was in DC and live a much cheaper lifestyle.
And here's the thing: I don't care if people work remotely for the most part. The reason why he's asking for this is not because it's really that big of a deal. It's because that's how they do things in secret. That's how they hide in the shadows, and that's what they've been doing since COVID. And this puts them up front and center. You can be observed, because the problem is these people. A lot of these people just can't be trusted.
Yeah, there's no accountability if people don't show up at all.
Right.
If you're going to get a government salary and lifetime pensions, you actually need to prove you've earned it. And we know for a fact that there are an awful lot of people with these government jobs. They think they can never be fired. They never have to work. There's no accountability whatsoever. That's a big issue with public sector unions that got negotiated with their own Congress people who they then would lobby for. Or I'm sorry, it's a big circle.
Public sector unions are a conflict of interest. And I can speak from direct experience. I worked for a city for 4 years. So I've worked a government job. And I've never come across a more disorganized, overspending, lazy office in my life. I've not worked for that office long enough now. I doubt this will come back and bite. I also refused to become a member of the union. I was one of two individuals in this entire city refused to do that. And I thought I only saw this stuff in movies. Because I refused to become a member of the union, I was attacked repeatedly, including slash tires, broken. One person broke the side view mirror of my truck, ticked off because I wouldn't join the union. I should not be allowed to reap the benefits of their hard work and their willingness to strike, kind of thing. And it's basically an entitled bunch of lazy babies.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I'm not saying the entire need for unions over 100 years ago wasn't very much.
No, and I'm not saying every government worker is an overpaid, entitled baby that whines all the time, but an awful lot of them are.
Yeah, there is.
And remember, remember that a lot of this stuff, there's precedent. Now, the first thing that Thomas Jefferson did when he took office as president of the United States is he fired half of the bureaucracy, the Federalist Party half.
Yeah, it's a heck of a good precedent.
Yeah, the Federalist Party, by the way, never recovered from that. Their true power was that embedment into the system.
No, they just decided to wreck the country from the bench.
Yeah.
All right, going on to our next one. Oh, absolutely constitutional. He definitely has that authority.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Ending the weaponization of the federal government. Some of these titles are just phenomenal. By the authority vested in me, we'll skip ahead to the purpose. The American people have witnessed the previous administration engage in a systematic campaign against its perceived political opponents, weaponizing the legal force of numerous federal law enforcement agencies and the intelligence community against those perceived political opponents in the form of investigations, prosecutions, civil enforcement actions, and other related actions. So he's putting a stop to that. So here's the policy. It is the policy of the United. First of all, everything he just said is 100% true. We all know it.
Mm-hmm.
We saw that the lawfare was probably some of the worst we've ever seen in this country. It is a policy of the United States to identify and take appropriate action to correct past misconduct by the federal government related to the weaponization of law enforcement and the weaponization of the intelligence community. This is important. They're taking appropriate action to correct the past misconduct by the federal government. This is an announcement that they are going to investigate those who weaponize the government.
What comes to mind is FBI and, right off the bat, but you've also got NSA and, a lot of the others.
Yeah, if you were part of that, you were probably have hired a lawyer by now.
Yeah.
The Attorney General shall, in consultation with the head of all departments and agencies of the U.S., shall take appropriate action to review the activities of all departments and agencies exercising civil or criminal enforcement authority in the United States. They're talking about, he says, not limited to the Department of Justice, the SEC, the Federal Trade Commission over the last 4 years, and identify any instances where a department's agency's conduct appears to have been contrary to the purposes and policies of this order. And they'll have to submit a report. It gets better. The DNI, if we get one, that's Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation, which should be happening tomorrow, in consultation with the heads of the appropriate departments and agencies within the intelligence community, shall take all appropriate action to review the activities of the intelligence community over the last 4 years and identify any instances where the IC's conduct appears to have been contrary to the purpose of this order. Another shot across the bow. Kind of reminds me of JFK saying he's going to scatter the CIA to 1,000 pieces. That didn't work.
But again, the executive branch, and these are all under the executive branch, and they operate at the pleasure of the president.
Yeah, he's not just saying you guys are going to stop doing it. He says, we're going to take a look at what you did. Mm-hmm. And that's where it gets scary.
You know, and it go back to looking at the boss over a small business, you know. That's what he basically is. If the boss has the allowance to look at the books and look at the, activities and whatever, then the president should be able to as well.
Okay, we can skip over all the little details of that because the big picture of this is what's important. We're going to see some headlines come out of this, whether we see perp walks or actual prosecutions. The future will tell, but he's absolutely aware of the weaponization of the government, and they are going after it. This is basically a declaration of war against some people inside the government. We'll see just how many people in D.C. are actually straight shooters. As I like to say, that's really it's the bad actors have the bottleneck positions, and the entire government's not corrupt. There are straight shooters out there that will do the right thing, and that's going to be put to the test here over the next 4 years.
And that's why I get upset when people say, well, the government does this and the government doesn't. No, there are segments or sections of government. Even during its worst moments, there are people, like you said, that are straight shooters.
Yeah, and we've got a set of rules that they have to follow. And, that's why they can't destroy evidence, even though they do sometimes. A lot of stuff should be coming to light here very soon. Is this executive order within the president's authority?
Absolutely.
Would not agree more.
Mm-hmm. Once again, and I don't mean to sound like a broken record. The president is the head of the executive branch, and executive orders. Purpose of them are proclamations or instructions to the executive branch, which is exactly what this is.
Very good. Okay, moving on. We have an executive order restoring freedom of speech and ending federal censorship. The purpose, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, an amendment essential to the success of our republic. Thank you for using that word. Enshrines the right. You can tell Trump didn't write this one. That's the joke that he always calls us democracy that just drives us nuts. Enshrines the right of the American people to speak freely in the public square without government interference. Over the last 4 years, the previous administration trampled free speech rights by censoring American speech on online platforms, often by exerting substantial coercive pressure on third parties, such as social media companies, to moderate, deplatform, and otherwise suppress speech that the federal government did not approve. We're talking COVID. We're talking vaccine. We're talking questioning the 2020 election. I've been censored. We know people have been kicked off platforms, lost their livelihood, and worse. They've prosecuted people, taken away people's medical licenses. And this all happened. We lived through it. This is saying no more.
Yeah, I've had articles unpublished. I've had videos taken down, and I've been kicked off of 2 platforms.
Yeah, I got a YouTube video nuked just last week, and I had someone on there talking about the health benefits of silver. And of course, we had to discuss COVID, and boom, that video lasted about 3 minutes on YouTube. So their policies haven't changed yet. All right, let's go. Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because this is going to be this is a big issue. I talked about this 3 years ago when I was teaching substituting for Doug in his Constitution class in Carlsbad, California. I did talked about a big case which is called Missouri versus Biden, and that basically they've got all kinds of discovery of the actual emails of government officials coercing and threatening the people at the big tech companies. A lot of this was
and let's understand something real quick here when it comes to the First Amendment and your rights and all of that. A business can conduct business as they see fit. If they don't like certain people saying certain things on their platform, that's their business. That's not the problem. The problem is when government gets involved with that and says, hey, you need to censor that. You need to get rid of Congress. Cannot do that. The federal government cannot do that. Congress shall make no law is the first words in the First Amendment. So it's not whether or not a private business based on their own policies for their own reasons can guide what's said. It's whether or not the federal government can be involved. And that's what was going on here.
Yeah,
and we had Zuckerberg come out and say, hey, we were getting phone calls. Hey, why didn't you censor this? You need to censor that.
And we saw even more examples of this in the Twitter files after Elon Musk, bought Twitter. I mean, we've got reams of evidence of how bad this is. Missouri versus Biden is a case that's ongoing. Right. And it is a big deal. It's basically, in a nutshell, what Doug just said is the government can't suppress your free speech, but it also can't use the power of the government and use coercion to get private actors to do what it otherwise could not do. And that's what they were doing. They were running an end around. And the big part is this was coordinated through the State Department to a very large degree. That's problematic, especially considering the State Department is supposed to be conducting international affairs, not domestic, suppression of speech. Where do they get that authority? And it's sort of what I talk about all the time. This whole foreign policy complex, which is the Pentagon, the State Department, the CIA, all their contractors, have been acting as a government in and of itself since post-World War II, toppling foreign governments and interfering with domestic affairs, which they're not supposed to do. And it hasn't mattered much if there's a Republican or a Democrat president in the White House. This complex, the real decision makers of our foreign policy, think that they're above that. They're a fourth branch of government, and it is a problem that the Trump administration is taking on head on.
Yeah, well, we have a history of operations that have gotten involved in controlling the message. Operation Mockingbird comes to mind, but and this is just an extension of that.
Yes, very much so. But that's really what you want to talk about who the deep state is. This is what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. This is the real deep state. Yeah, we can go. I mean, I go into a lot more detail about this on some of my other shows, but this is more of a constitutional show. Bottom line is they cannot be doing this.
And it's a very constitutional authority, executive order. Once again, it's the president's job to have his executive branch operating the way he wants it to.
Yeah. Now, the amount of accountability we get from the people that transgressed this remains to be seen. But considering it was one of the very first executive orders he signed on January 20th, I would say his administration has made this a very high priority, as it should be. So that's a big one. All right, next we have the initial rescissions of harmful executive orders and actions. This is basically just reversing a ton of Biden's executive orders, including advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through federal government. That was basically affirmative action.
And as you go through these, when you read these, you ask yourself, was the original executive order constitutional? Is it the federal government's business get involved with something like affirmative action? Courts have agree with us. No. Does the federal government have the authority to dictate to businesses how they operate? No, and so on. Does the federal government have an authority regarding gender identity or sexual orientation? No. It goes on and on and on.
This next executive order that he's rescinding is important. and this was something Biden did his first day, was ensuring a lawful and accurate enumeration and apportionment pursuant to the decennial census. Every 10 years, we take a census.
Yeah.
The issue, and Trump should have been a lot stronger on this leading to the 2020 census, is the issue really is, can they count illegal aliens?
And it came down to a lawsuit that asked the question, is the question, are you a citizen, constitutional on the census? The court said, no, it's not, and it is. We can, go through, there's two places in which the apportionment regarding the census and the members of Congress that is mentioned twice in the Constitution. And the first one is Article 1, Section 2, and the second one is in the 14th Amendment. And it's very interesting because what it says is that the people being counted, excluding Indians not taxed. Why excluding Indians not taxed? Why aren't they counted? Because they're not citizens. If they're not taxed, their allegiance is not to the United States. Their allegiance is to a tribe. And understand here that because they are allegiance to a tribe, they're not voting. So the representation, it doesn't represent them. So why should they be counted for that? And so illegal aliens should not be counted. Are you a citizen? Non-citizens should not be counted for the purpose of appropriation. Should they be counted in the census? Yes. We need to know who's here, how many people here, and all that. But should that number also be counted towards the apportionment for the number of representatives that a state has in the United States House of Representatives? No.
And why is this important? So important because the census every 10 years determines how many seats in Congress each state gets, and also how many electoral votes. Had the census in 2020 not counted the illegals, the blue states would have lost another 7 electoral votes. And that's a big deal if you think about how tight our Congress is right now.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at all the migration from blue states to red since 2020, the 2030 census is going to be incredibly impactful. We should see probably another 10 or so seats shift. And that starts.
And also that's important when you consider how weirdly close the presidential elections can be.
Yes. And a lot of people were, they're pointing out with Biden, flying and busing illegal aliens all over the country. It seemed that the people were asking the question, well, why are so many more going to blue states than red? Which actually turned out to be the case. Well, that's exactly the reason. So we should get a fair and accurate census in 2030. You're going to hear all the usual screeching about, well, if you're counting illegals, you won't get an accurate count. Well,
no, count them, but have them check, but have that box marked. Oh. Are you a citizen? And by the way, double check it too.
Okay. There's a couple more on this I want to hit because it matters. These are the big EOs he got rid of on day one. All right. Next one down here. He got rid of Executive Order 13987, which is about the COVID response. Basically, he got rid of Biden's order there, organizing and mobilizing the United States government. No longer an emergency. Here's a big one: preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Now, here's where Doug's question: was that executive order that Biden gave in 2021, was that constitutional?
No, federal government's got no authority over that issue.
I would agree. And Trump has basically said this administration is going to only recognize 2 sexes, male and female.
And not only are we recognizing that for internal business, but we're not going to put out any law that requires that anything be determined based on gender identity and sexual orientation for 2 reasons. Number one, because that's none of the federal government's business. And number 2, equal protection under the law means that it doesn't matter.
This one is going to raise some eyebrows because he rescinded an order for the ethics commitments by executive branch personnel. Well, the devil's in the details there, and that was a ridiculous executive order. We kind of talked about that at the time. My favorite one here is Biden's order was protecting the public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis.
restoring science.
Uh-huh. The science is settled, Doug. That's what Obama told us. Unfortunately, science is never settled. And the very nature of science is to challenge existing assumptions at all times. And anyway, that's
the reason why most of these things are still considered theories, because it can't be totally beyond doubt, shadow of a doubt proven. But you know what can be proven and has been proven? Carbon dioxide is not the cause of any change in temperature. The sun is.
In any case, that's gone. We are no longer going to have that. A couple more worth mentioning. Ensuring an equitable pandemic response and recovery. Obviously, when you see the word equitable or equity, they're talking about giving what they call non-whites a leg up in the recovery and the funding and AIDS. That was garbage. That was affirmative action. That's now gone, thankfully. Never should have been allowed. Is there anything else here that was worth mentioning? Oh, protecting the federal workforce was an executive order Biden signed. That's now gone, obviously.
At the bottom of your screen, the tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, which ties into that other one.
Mm-hmm. Here's another one that they got rid of: enabling all qualified Americans to serve their country in uniform. Well, the word qualified is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. There will be no more transgender surgeries paid for by the taxpayer in the U.S. military, and they are no longer going to lower standards of fitness just so they can meet their quotas. Pretty much, this is by definition constitutional, because he's just basically erasing what his predecessor had done.
Mm-hmm.
Flying the flag of the United States at full staff on Inauguration Day, that speaks for itself, unless you want to talk about the history of that.
Well, now, see, I live very close to the California state line. Every time I go into California, I have to go through a check station, for inspection to make sure I don't have any fruits or vegetables on me, because, we're worried about any bugs getting in the state. Don't worry about illegal aliens, but don't let the bug in. And they're flying the flag at this moment, still at half staff. And it says on a big sign next to it, not commemorating, but in respect to Jimmy Carter or something like that. My first thought is I expect a former president to receive certain respects. But, a couple of days, you're done. I don't care who it is. Move on. But see, Carter is a big deal to the left, a big deal to the deep state, big deal to what we're fighting against, because he was one of them, and and not just in the sense of leftist positions, but also the globalistic community.
He most certainly was, even more so after his presidency. He took a really even a harder turn to the left.
Mm-hmm. If that was even possible, considering his presidency.
Yeah, the one thing he did, and I will always love Jimmy Carter for this, is the Halloween massacre, where he fired over 1,000 CIA people on a single night. That didn't go over too well with a certain foreign policy complex, and that showed when it came to the Iran crisis. They certainly did not have his back. What's the standard for president? How long do you normally fly the flag at half mast?
I don't know what it is, but I believe it's supposed to be a week, but it's longer than a week.
Yeah, we're coming up on a month here pretty quick.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's over, at least for the inauguration. So is that within the president's authority to determine how the flags are flown?
Absolutely.
Okay. Here's where President Trump designates all his chairman and acting chairman. We can skip all that. That's been headline news. All the confirmation hearings going on. We know the whole list. And obviously that is within his purview to designate his chairs. I don't think we need to go through that list, do we?
No.
Okay. Same here. President Trump announces acting cabinet and cabinet level positions.
And to answer your question, I did a quick look up. Typically, it's 30 days.
Okay, that's what I thought it was.
Fly a flag, but even then, it's been longer than that, hasn't it?
I want to say he passed away in January, like the first week or something. I seem to recall
So we're real close then.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always believed a week is enough, but
and the rest.
Anyways, that's up to the president. Once again, that's an executive branch. I mean, if the courthouses want to fly their flags and have staff, that's their business. But all the other federal buildings, it's his business.
Yeah, the Supreme Court never put it up to full mast for the inauguration. The Supreme Court building was the only one in D.C. that had it at half mast.
Right, and because he can't dictate to them what they do. No. They're a different branch.
These first four, because obviously reverse, are all about him naming his cabinet and cabinet level positions. We don't. I'm just not going to go through the roll call. Obviously, this is by definition constitutional. He's got to name his own people. All right, so now since we started this series, we have had a bunch of new ones have come out, and we probably have time to get through them.
Okay, let's do it.
Protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation. Obviously, this is about the sex change people under the age of 19. Mm-hmm. Why 19 instead of 18? Well, because they still have kids in high school at 18, probably not 19. Now, this is an interesting question, Doug. Is this one constitutional?
Federal government's got no business being involved in the first place with that issue. So, that's tough. The states are supposed to come up with laws regarding individual citizens. That said, this is so egregious, I understand why he wants to tackle it.
If he's going to declare an emergency, he can give an executive order, but I 100% agree this is a state issue. The federal government has no business. This is reinstating service members discharged under the military's COVID-19 vaccination mandate.
Yeah, absolutely constitutional.
Can we just take a second to applaud this one? This impacts people you and I both know in Southern California. People lost, I know one guy who had a 19-year career, couldn't get to 20 years, and it mattered. He was a helicopter pilot. And they, some of these people were getting dishonorable discharges as well, and that's being reversed. So this is one of the best executive orders we have seen.
Yeah,
I think I'd like to see this apply to a lot of other industries.
I have a Los Angeles police department friend of mine who came to my classes occasionally in Beaumont and Chino when I was doing those. Vincent wound up moving to Texas to be employed by the sheriff's department there, but and he had this long, long career, worked his way up, wouldn't get vaxxed. LAPD fired him, and he was one of 7 that was in a lawsuit against LAPD, and it's still ongoing.
Yeah, I went to with some of our favorite people like Audra. Went up to LA for a couple of protests. Beverly Hills PD, a couple of other LAPDs, because they can't protest on their own. It's in their contract. They can't protest their own government. So we went up there and did that for them to protest against the mandates. No, and it's that was such a brutal time.
Now the next one's interesting me. Storing America's fighting force.
Because these are 2 of these. Because it goes side by side with prioritizing military excellent readiness, and I want to read this one first.
Okay.
The United States military has a clear mission to protect the American people and our homeland as the world's most lethal and effective fighting force. Success in this existential mission requires a singular focus on developing the requisite warrior ethos, and the pursuit of military excellence cannot be diluted to accommodate political agendas or other ideologies harmful to unit cohesion. Read between the lines there. He's absolutely talking about this transgender garbage in the military. That is gone. Yep, here it is. Consistent with a military mission and long-standing DoD policy expressing a false gender identity, in quotes, divergent from an individual's sex cannot satisfy the rigorous standards necessary for military service. Amen.
Also creates confusion and hesitation within the ranks, which, to be honest with you, if you're in the field, will get you killed.
Yeah, and I would expect they're going to clean house on a lot of the officers who push this stuff down everyone's throats. We are going to see a cleansing of the military for that. All right, so that one goes hand in hand with restoring America's fighting force. This one says, no individual or group within our armed forces should be preferred or disadvantaged on the basis of sex, race, ethnicity, or creed. Getting rid of race and sex-based discrimination. No more affirmative action in the armed forces. This is one he's getting rid of all the DEI offices. A DEI office means an office, division, job, or other unit of institution established for the purpose of influencing, hiring, blah, blah, blah. You know all the rest of this gender ideology. Sorry, DEI is gone from the military.
That's abolishing the DEI bureaucracy.
Now, we're seeing a lot of places these DEI people are just changing their titles.
Right.
And, that's not going to fly because the internet never forgets. We've already caught a number of people trying to do this, just changing their title and trying to do an end around. That's not going to cut it. This executive order addresses that directly. Is this within the president's purview?
Absolutely. Commander-in-Chief.
100% agreed. All right. We have the Iron Dome for America. For those who don't know, the Iron Dome is the name of the missile defense force that Israel has. Mostly U.S. and Israeli both technology went into it.
Israel's interesting. They take American technology and then they tweak it to make it better. And the Iron Dome technology is one of the reasons why Israel still exists.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Iron Dome is far from perfect. Iran has proven that in the last year, and it certainly can't do much against hypersonic missiles.
And it really ties into the original idea by Reagan, the Star Wars system.
Yeah, he mentions that in the CEO. So what he says is the threat of attack by ballistic, hypersonic, and cruise missiles and other advanced aerial attacks remains the most catastrophic threat facing the United States. He says, as you said, as Doug points out, President Reagan endeavored to build an effective defense against nuclear attacks. And while this program resulted in many technological advances, it was canceled before its goal could be realized.
Yeah, because today's Democrats are against government efficiency. Back then, they were against defending us.
And since the United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002 and initiated development of limited homeland missile defense, official U.S. homeland missile defense policy has remained only to stay ahead of rogue nation threats and accidental or unauthorized missile launches. So what is this policy actually going to do? The United States will provide for the common defense of its citizens and the nation by deploying and maintaining a next-generation missile defense shield. The U.S. will deter and defend its citizens and critical infrastructure against any foreign attack. And the United States will guarantee its secure second strike capability implementation. Within 60 days of this order, the Secretary of Defense, that's Mr. Hegseth now, will submit to the President a reference architecture, capabilities-based requirements, and implementation plan for the next generation missile defense shield. The architecture shall include, at a minimum, plans for, you can imagine, we don't need to go through all that. It also talks about Allied and Theater Missile Defense Review. Basically, it's bringing our military up to modern standards in many ways. It's going to be very expensive.
Now, our first question is, would the Founding Fathers approve of this? And I respond with George Washington's quote, "The best way to keep the peace is to be prepared for war."
Yeah. And
that's just a reality.
Yeah, there's a Metallica song that quotes that. To secure peace is to prepare for war. It's a song that just went through my head when you said that. Is this constitutional? Is it within the president's purview to authorize a bunch of spending on defense?
Absolutely, Commander-in-Chief. If he needs more funding, he can request it from Congress.
Yeah, so this executive order is asking the Secretary of Defense to give me a plan, and which would then be submitted to Congress. That would be the proper way of doing it.
Now, that said, there's already a pile of money that's designated for national defense. So some money is already available, but probably not all that he needs.
And probably save a lot if we pulled back from a lot of foreign entanglements.
And this is true.
Or if the rest of the NATO
another George Washington attitude.
You know, what's interesting is the military-industrial complex is among the blob that's went after Trump for 4 years, and yet here he is, consistent with his last term, is really spending on defense. Now, hopefully, we don't have any more $500 toilet seats.
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing about that is Thomas Jefferson believed that while you did need to have a military, it didn't need to be very strong during peacetime, and then if war came along, then you would just create your army really quick. And so during Jefferson's presidency, he actually reduced the size of the armed forces significantly and practically got to the point where no new vessels were being built. And as much as I love Jefferson, I believe he was wrong there. I go back to Washington. I'm a firm believer that the best way to keep peace is to be prepared for war. The best way to keep the bad guys from being bad guys is to be stronger than them. And a lot of those bad guy ideas out there, all they understand is force and strength. Now, Islam being one of them. If you're not strong enough to push back, they will push harder. But if they know that you can take them out, they won't push at all.
All right, moving on to the next one. Well, too bad we couldn't have Ron on for this. The National Day of Remembrance of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, 2025.
The president asked for pictures to be taken to make sure that there would never get to the point where people would say that didn't happen. Just saying.
Yeah, there's an argument to be made that all the evidence, all the photographs, everything was in Soviet territory at the time, when all this stuff was discovered. And that's pretty clear that they probably exaggerated the numbers a bit. I've seen accurate numbers, probably closer to 2.5 million people. But if it's even one person, it was a problem.
Well, I believe the number really is 6 million, but I don't know if it's necessarily all Jews. That might be a combination of Christians and Jews and other persons that were in the camps. But nonetheless, it was horrific. It was a huge number. Shouldn't be forgotten. And who cares what the reason was? We had a government, a leader that was systematically committing genocide against a particular group of people. Once again, there's all kinds of arguments as to why that would be. I don't care. You don't do that.
No, and I agree. The Holocaust is awful, but we've had other Holocausts throughout history. The Holodomor being one. Culture, what was it? The Chinese purge, where they killed like 30 million people, their own people. Yeah, this has happened far too often.
Abortion would be the one I would bring to mind.
Yeah, so human history is littered with this stuff. It's just, the thing that I think that bothers people is this is the one that you can't question. And, it's a tragedy. It happened. So can the president declare a national day of remembrance for something?
Absolutely. That's a proclamation. Remember, proclamation or instructions to the executive branch. This is a proclamation. It's just like the National Day of Prayer. You're not ordered by law to remember the liberation of Auschwitz, but as a government, as a country, should I say, we are collectively, largely through this proclamation doing so.
Okay, moving on. Here's a memorandum for the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Health and Human Service, and the Administrator of the United States for International Development. I think there's going to be something worth reading here. I have not read this one yet, so the subject is the Mexico City policy. I hereby revoke the presidential memorandum from January of 2021 for the Secretary of State, the aforementioned. And he mentions USAID, protecting women's health at home and abroad, and reinstate the presidential memorandum that he put in 2017 called the Mexico City policy. Okay, so what is he actually saying here? I direct the Secretary of State to take all necessary actions to the extent permitted by law to ensure that U.S. taxpayer dollars do not fund organizations or programs that support or participate in the management of a program of coercive abortion or involuntary sterilization.
Bad enough abortions going on here, but we're also sending out money for it to go on elsewhere. he's stopping it.
Okay. Well, that sounds like it's probably within the executive branch's purview.
Well, and what that is, now we get back to the power of impoundment. I'm not spending money there.
Very good. This should be a fun one.
Next one, enforcing the Hyde Amendment, is now abortion domestically. So you've got the first one, non-domestic. This one's domestically.
Does he have the does he have the ability to enforce an amendment?
Well, this is an amendment. This is an amendment to a law. And basically it is he's basically saying the previous administration was refusing to execute this law. I'm going to execute it.
Yeah, it's basically no federal funding of abortion.
Right.
And that is now ended, which means I would think that no more of the circular funding where U.S. tax dollars go to Planned Parenthood, which turns around and donates to Democrat candidates.
Yeah, we'll see how that works out. We'll see what happens. So
this is a big one. All right, here's one that everyone been all over the news: emergency measures to provide water resources in California and improve disaster response in certain areas. What he basically said is the water must flow to Southern California. Now, is this constitutional, or is that a state issue? Is he overstepping his bounds here, Doug?
I think he's overstepping his bounds. That said, and I don't necessarily agree with this, but I'm just telling you, with the way the legal industry is looking at it, he's calling it an emergency measure. And you know how it is, a war hamster with emergency powers.
Oh, I love them so much.
Yeah, the Constitution is set aside for a moment so that emergency can be addressed.
It'll never be abused.
Yeah, so from a precedent point of view, he has every legal right to do this. From a constitutional standpoint, not necessarily. It's up to the state. If Californians don't like it, they need to take action or start moving out of the state. Oh, wait, that is what's happening.
Oh, did you recently leave California?
Yeah, last July.
Hey, I did it the year before that. For different reasons.
What's hilarious too is here in Oregon, Oregonians don't like Californians coming to their state, but the ones that scream the loudest are former Californians. It's hilarious.
Well, I spent about 8 years as a child in Oregon. That was absolutely the truth. They hated California license plates when they see them. They blame Californians moving to Oregon for everything that went wrong, but that was a different breed of Oregon.
Especially Portland.
It was a different breed of Oregonian back then.
Well, I remember back in 1985 when I was in the United States Navy, USS Chandler DDG 996, got a missile destroyer. We actually traveled up the Columbia River and docked in Portland. Did tours of the ship. I actually was given tours and stuff. A family there actually adopted me, took me up to Mount Hood and stuff like that because I'd never seen snow before. And it was a good time. The town was, reasonable. Yeah, I was known for being liberal lefty, but you weren't worried about being jumped by some guy in a black, mask, per se. So as bad as Portland was, it's definitely bad now. But here's the thing, and I want to say this real quick, just a little side commentary. Oregon's just like any other state in the United States. The city's the problem. Portland, Eugene, Salem, at the I-5 corridor, and then the bigger towns along the coast, Coos Bay and Astoria. Astoria is really an extension of Portland. But the rest of the state's about as conservative as to get. And in Oregon especially, you get up into the hills, I can't tell much difference between the Oregon hillbillies and the Ozark hillbillies, to be honest with you. They've got a lot in common, just saying.
No, that's why so many of those counties have already voted to leave Oregon and join Idaho, the Greater Idaho Project.
Or become the state of Jefferson.
Which probably will never happen, but we'll see.
Yeah, no.
All right, next one's great. Council to assess the FEMA. You've heard Trump saying FEMA has been terrible.
Well, and think about something he said about FEMA. There's too much bureaucracy. Why not give the money to the state and let the state appropriate it? They know best on how. Yeah, that's the whole point of state sovereignty. Hey, we need help. Federal government, can you help us out? Here's some money. Take care of your problem. That's the way to do it. For the federal government to have this bureaucracy to play games with the state, if they need emergency assistance, and they call for it, they ask for it, is ridiculous. Now, and then so someone says to me after I said this not long ago, yeah, but what if the state doesn't allocate the funds the way they're supposed to? Then those people won't be in office very long. It exposes them for who they are.
Yeah, and we've seen, I mean, this goes back to several administrations. We saw it in the Katrina. We've seen FEMA just absolutely make disasters worse than they could otherwise be. Does the federal government have any role in disaster relief or management, or should this only be left to the states?
They do if the state requests the help, and that's what a state of emergency is. When a state declares a state of emergency, they're basically asking for federal help. Until then, the federal government has no authority to go into the state.
Let's say this council comes up with a really negative report on FEMA. What would the process be to eliminate FEMA or to completely, create a totally other version of it?
Get rid of it. It doesn't exist.
Can the president just get rid of it?
Mm-hmm.
Was FEMA created by Congress?
I believe they were. I think the departments are established by Congress, so Congress would have to actually get rid of it. But there are some sub-agencies that were created within the executive branch, and then the executive branch can get rid of them in that case.
You'd think a lot of what FEMA does is stuff that could be handled by the National Guard. Mm-hmm. I would think that would be a more efficient way of doing it, and that does.
Well, once again,
that does
90% of FEMA's job is help with disaster relief. The disaster relief is better taken care of locally. Give them the money and then get out of the way.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, there's been a ton of graft and siphoning off of disaster relief funds throughout the years. Katrina there's been all kinds of exposés of how poorly that money was
spent. Think about Katrina. We have to remember when it came to Katrina and FEMA, Bush, believe it or not, was following the Constitution in the sense of when he went in with FEMA. Governor Blanco at the time refused to declare a state of emergency. In other words, to refuse to request federal help. Federal government can't impose themselves on a state. So FEMA did have to hold back until the state called for help. And that's essentially what happened. But the problem is then once FEMA was supposed to go in, the bureaucracy mucked everything up so badly that nothing happened quickly. And then it just basically tripped over its own coattails.
Very good. All right, we got a bunch here we should be able to do pretty quickly. It should be able to get through all of them if I go rapid fire. First 100 hours, historic action to kick off America's golden age. I think that's just Tim Trump bragging about all the things they've done with a rock'em sock'em robot approach. Removing barriers to American leadership and artificial intelligence.
This is important because basically the Biden administration told big tech, we are going to be in control of AI and the development. You're going to go through us first before you do anything. And Biden's plan was to classify artificial intelligence as quote unquote science. And according to the left, that means that any development could only be done through the federal government, period. And Trump said, no, I want AI to freely develop. I want us to be a leader. And the best way for us to be a leader is to allow the free market to do its thing. Let private industry innovate and have the opportunity for their profit as a result. In other words, unleash the free market. Now, before I go on, there's a lot of people who've argued with me about this. Yeah, but Doug, the dangers of artificial intelligence, how they're going to use it for surveillance. Yeah, but the fact is it exists. It's out there. And if we don't take a leadership role, it will be used against us. I would rather America be at the forefront of artificial intelligence than it be used against us because we decided to take our hands off the reins.
There's another point here, Doug, that's important. Is the reason they wanted to regulate AI is because they wanted to be the ones to program it. They wanted to be able to dictate the results. What they're scared to death of is they're going to get an AI that actually reveals the truth. And they don't want the public to be able to find that out. That is the biggest fear of the censorship class.
By the way, my favorite now way of looking stuff up on the internet now is using some of these AI functions. Bing's Copilot is my favorite.
Yeah, I've been using quite a bit of AI as well. Now, the thing to obviously to be careful about is it's not perfect yet. It doesn't always give the right answers, and there's some topics that you and I could be considered experts
Yeah,
on.
but what will happen though is it will give you the sources that it found on
Mhm.
it that you couldn't find otherwise doing your search engine search.
Yeah, it's just a much faster search engine,
Mhm.
and I think it's going to actually absolutely be a threat to Google's business model. Their monopoly on search, I think, is dead. I haven't used a Google search engine in years, and now I've got no reason to do it ever again.
I use Google for a couple of things because they're better on it. For example, if I'm watching a movie and I want to see who the cast is, Google's the best at that. But other stuff, most of the time, it's like I said, I go to Bing Copilot most of the time. As for my regular search engine, I use freespoke.com quite a bit, and Result Hunter and startpage.com. I use those more than I use Google.
Okay, moving. Oh, by the way,
Oh, and of course there's Brave also. Don't forget
yeah,
Brave.
Brave's great. The search engine isn't all that good anymore. It doesn't give me. You got to go to pages on Brave to find the right result. But
Yeah, they're starting to tie into the mainstream stuff. That's been kind of going on with Result Hunter also.
yeah, DuckDuckGo jumped the shark a while back.
Yeah, freespoke.com I think is the one I use the most, aside from Bing's Copilot.
President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. He's just naming people. Is there any names on there that we care about? Did he actually name the people? It's an important position for many reasons, but again, we talked about with climate. Basically they determine what is and what isn't science, and more importantly, what gets funded.
That's ultimately what it's about.
Yeah, and this has been abused for decades by the establishment. Hopefully, that gets reversed to some degree. I would imagine the universities are going to have quite a bit to say on this. So this is something worth watching. Declassification of records concerning the assassination of JFK. That also included RFK and Martin Luther King. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, so far, what we've seen is stuff that we've kind of already concluded. It just confirms a lot of what we've already concluded. What we'll see.
Yeah, there's 7 names that were kept back from the release in 2021. Do you want me to pull those names up? Because if you see them, we're on to something. I wasn't ready to do this today. Yeah, there's 7 names. Several of them are CIA operatives that were in Dallas on or around the day in October of 2020. I'm sorry, 1963. There's another woman who actually was the one who was the witness to Lee Harvey Oswald when he came back from Cuba in Mexico City at the embassy. But these are the ones who really know what happened. And those 7 names have been redacted, David Phillips being one of them. If those names come out and are not redacted, then we're on to something.
Well, what based on what I've seen so far of the records that have come out, and not all of them have yet, is that a lot of our assumptions are true. And a lot of people don't know this, but right after it happened, Israel was actually given a lot of the blame, as well as Soviet embedments. And what I've always thought was, no, I believe that it was Vice President Johnson tied directly to intelligence agencies, because they saw Kennedy as dangerous because he was anti-communist, and also he wanted to mess with things like the Federal Reserve and things like that. And they saw him as dangerous to the system, to the Leviathan they had created. And we are starting to see some stuff that point towards the reality, the possible reality that Johnson was partly behind a lot of this.
Yeah, I would have thought Johnson had plausible deniability and would not know specifically. I think Alan Dulles gave the order. I will never. That's going to be very hard to get me off that position. All right, moving on. Strengthening America. Oh, and by the way, if the revelations do come out, we will do an emergency show and break it down a lot.
Absolutely.
I've done a lot of research on JFK. I've done several shows on my channel, both live and on the internet. If there's any revelations, we will jump on immediately.
I've done my fair share. I know more than the average bear out there, but I probably couldn't hold a candle to someone like Brady on it, but I definitely know more about it than the average bear out there.
All right, next we have strengthening American leadership in digital financial technology. This one scares a few people.
Mm-hmm.
The digital asset industry. He's basically promoting crypto to some degree. Talks about public blockchain networks without persecution. For those who don't know, the SEC, Gary Gensler, was very anti-crypto. At the same time, they're talking about building a central bank digital currency. So that's where the slippery slope gets in here. He talks about promoting and protecting the sovereignty of the U.S. dollar, which would go against the CBDC.
And that part is constitutional. But really, when it comes down to the creation of money, the most constitutional part would be not recognizing any other monies other than American money as the official money of America. That would be the only really truly constitutional. If he wants to regulate with federal government, he wants to import some of it into federal regulatory control, not constitutional.
So this next clause is important. He talks about promoting and protecting sovereignty of the U.S. dollar, including through actions to promote the development and growth of lawful and legitimate dollar-backed stablecoins worldwide. There's an issue here, or the key words are lawful and legitimate dollar-backed stablecoins.
Mm-hmm.
I am very concerned that a lot of these what is a stablecoin? Stablecoin is basically a cryptocurrency that is backed by something else. It's a derivative. Maybe it's a U.S. dollar, maybe it's something else. At the end of the day, you're supposed to have the amount of dollars that you say you have. I am concerned.
So in other words, it's not a fiat.
It's not leveraged. I am concerned a lot of these stable coins do not have the backing that they say they have, and therefore it'd be a run on a bank anytime that was exposed. I do not think they would pass audit. I'm very concerned with stable coins. They are also used for a lot of nefarious purposes. So this is something to keep an eye on, and there's going to be very strong opinions on both sides of that. But he is going to be pro-blockchain, and we're going to get some developments on this. I've always said our eventual currency is a blockchain, decentralized coin that is backed by physical things like commodities and real estate and gold, and also has a physical component. So in case the internet ever goes down or electricity is out, you can still transact. So that's where I think we're going.
Well, money is not money if it doesn't have a physical component, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's something Alan would agree with you on 100%. The Bitcoin people disagree, but that's not this show. Federal recognition of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. Great. Happy for the Lumbees. And absolutely, that's probably within his power. Executive grant of clemency for Terrence Sutton. Do we want to know what Terrence did? Yeah, let's give him a quick look. I don't remember Terrence Sutton. Do you?
No.
That doesn't give us any detail about what he did. So he got a full.
But it's a pardon.
All right. He got a clemency. Okay. He got full and unconditional pardon. Designation of Ansar Allah this is the Houthis. They are now a terrorist organization. That impacts the way the Navy can address them, etc. Hopefully, it will open up the Red Sea to trade to some degree, but I'm not sure. Our Navy's been getting its butt kicked by a bunch of savages, that's according to our military people. Their missile technology seems to do the trick. Another grand.
All right, so Terrence Sutton was an officer that was basically arrested for his involvement in the death of 20-year-old Karen Hilton Brown, which was a case that drew protests on the heels of the murder of George Floyd. And so they're from DC Metropolitan Police.
Got it. Another clemency for Andrew Zabowski. Nominations transmitted to the Senate. Don't need to go through those. Oops, did I go too far? Hang on. No, I'm on 2. Ending wasteful government. Okay, these ones we already did. So we are caught up.
All right. So as more show up, we may do another show on this stuff.
Yeah, we'll give them some time.
And I'm glad at the beginning of the program we did talk about the presidential power of impoundment. I actually wrote an article last May on that exact power. And so if ever you want to check it out, I don't know how you'd find it other than going through your search engine to make sure my name's a part of it, because the search engines don't like what I write unless my name's a part of it. And the one I have on Canada Free Press will probably show up before my website. But if you go to DouglasVGibbs.com, go back to May, you can find it also.
Very good. Well, thank you for doing the show. We will reconvene whenever necessary. If there's stuff that breaks fast, we'll definitely be doing something. I think maybe next week we ought to get our friend Ron Partain on and start going through the Confederate Constitution.
Well, he's been asking about that now 2 Tuesdays in a row. He says, "Hey, when are we going to do that?" And so now he's, it's you don't tease a child with the toy, but don't give it to him. You've got you.
That's going to be a very fun show. The Confederate Constitution. Forget about what you think about slavery, North, South, any of that. We're looking at the Confederate Constitution. It is basically they had 80 years to learn from our Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and see if they could figure out. There's a couple things they wanted to improve upon, and it'll be a fascinating show.
Small spoiler. Think hybrid of Articles of Confederation and the United States Constitution.
Ooh, I like the way we're going there. All right, everybody. Thanks a lot. We'll see y'all soon.